"Step away from the spring, sir. You're trespassing on HOA property." The woman saying that was sitting behind a $25 ticket booth built on my land. Behind her, nearly 30 strangers were soaking in the private hot spring my family had owned since 1931. Then the HOA president arrived, pointed at my grandfather's fence, and threatened to tear it down if I interfered with her community amenity. She had been advertising my property online, selling tickets to tourists, and keeping every dollar. Worse, she believed 5 years of doing it had given her permanent rights. I didn't argue. I photographed the booth, opened the original deed, called a surveyor, and pulled a mud-stained maintenance notebook from my desk. By the time that notebook entered the case, someone was about to lose far more than a few tourist fees. But standing beside that spring, Renata Hollis still believed the ground beneath my boots belonged to her HOA. I had driven to the southern end of the property that morning because one of my trail cameras kept recording unfamiliar vehicles. At first, I assumed hikers were parking near the boundary by mistake. The property covered thousands of acres, and people occasionally took a wrong turn on the mountain roads. Then I saw the sign. Crestline Ridge Community Hot Spring, Day Access, $25. 12 vehicles were parked along the dirt track. Families carried towels and coolers toward the water. 2 people wore matching HOA volunteer shirts. One of them sat behind a folding table with a cash box, a card reader, and a stack of printed liability waivers. This was not a group of neighbors who had accidentally crossed the wrong fence. It was an organized business. I walked toward the booth and asked who had authorized it. The attendant barely looked up. "The HOA manages this area," she said. "Residents enter free. Visitors pay $25. I told her the spring was private property. She gave me the patient smile people use when they think they are explaining something obvious to a confused stranger. Then she pointed toward the main road. "If you have a complaint, contact the board. Until then, you need to leave." The woman collecting money on my land was ordering me off my own property, and she clearly believed she had every right to do it. The property covers roughly 5,700 acres of mountain ground in Montana. My great-grandfather acquired the original parcel in 1931. Over the following decades, the family added neighboring sections until the land stretched across forest, open pasture, rocky ridges, and several natural water sources. The hot spring sits near the southern boundary. It is not a resort pool. It is a natural basin fed by heated groundwater rising through fractured rock beneath the mountain. I work as a hydrological engineer, so water movement, erosion, drainage, and spring systems are things I understand professionally. But that spring mattered to me, for reasons that had nothing to do with my career. My grandfather taught me to repair the fence near that basin. He showed me how the water level changed with the snowmelt, and how to recognize erosion before it damaged the bank. The old fence was not beautiful. It leaned in places. Several posts had been replaced by hand. Different generations of wire ran along the same boundary. But it marked a line our family had respected and maintained for decades. That land was not abandoned. It had been watched, repaired, taxed, and protected for nearly a century. Crestline Ridge was developed much later on, approximately 320 acres adjoining the southern edge of our property. When construction began, I had no objection. People had a right to build homes on land they legally owned, just as my family had a right to protect ours. The first serious conflict came through a certified letter from the HOA president, Renata Hollis. The notice claimed my grandfather's fence failed to meet Crestline Ridge's aesthetic standards. It called the fence a visual blight and demanded that I replace it with an approved design or remove it entirely. There was one obvious problem. My land was not part of Crestline Ridge. I was not an HOA member. I had signed no covenants. The association had no architectural authority over my property. I sent a brief response explaining that. Renata replied that the fence bordered a shared recreational area and harmed the appearance of the community. That was the first time she referred to the hot spring as a community amenity. At the time, I assumed she had misunderstood the boundary. The ticket booth proved something much worse. She had already built a business around that supposed misunderstanding. That afternoon, I searched for the hot spring online. It took less than 5 minutes to find it. The HOA had posted professional-looking photographs of people soaking beneath the trees. One listing described the spring as an exclusive mountain amenity managed by Crestline Ridge. Another page offered day access to non-residents. The price was $25 per adult. The directions led tourists through the Crestline Ridge entrance, down a maintenance lane, across the old fence line, and directly onto my property. There were reviews from visitors going back years. Some praised the quiet location, others complained about parking, overcrowding, or inconsistent operating hours. Several mentioned paying cash to HOA volunteers. I saved everything: screenshots, web addresses, dates, photographs, prices, reviews, directions. I photographed the ticket booth, the waiver forms, the parking area, the card reader, and the sign calling it a community hot spring. Based on the dates and visitor numbers I could confirm, the HOA had collected at least $11,400. Possibly more. They had never contacted me. They had never requested permission. They had never offered compensation. They had simply decided that because the spring was valuable to their development, it belonged to their community. Then they started selling it. My first instinct was to close the access road immediately. Legally, I believed I had every right to do that. But anger is not evidence. If I shut the operation down before documenting it, the HOA could remove the advertisements, empty the cash box, and later describe everything as an innocent misunderstanding. Renata could claim the tourists had entered by accident. She could say no money had changed hands. She could even accuse me of threatening residents or interfering with an established recreational area. So I did not touch the booth. I did not argue with the volunteers. I did not confront the tourists, who had no reason to know they had been sold access to someone else's property. Instead, I started a file. I recorded dates, signs, prices, operating hours, vehicle counts, and the names listed on the public advertisements. Then I copied every letter Renata had sent concerning the fence and the supposed community amenity. The next morning, I called a property attorney. When I finished explaining the situation, he remained silent for a moment. Then he said, "Before we tell them anything, we prove everything." That was exactly what we did. The first step was a complete title search. We reviewed the current deed, earlier transfers, county records, plats, development documents, and every recorded easement affecting the southern boundary. The result was clear. My family owned the land. The hot spring sat inside the legal description of our parcel. No recorded easement granted Crestline Ridge residents access to it. No agreement designated it as shared recreational space. No covenant placed the property under HOA authority. Nothing in the title history allowed the association to operate a commercial attraction there. Then we hired a licensed surveyor. His crew located the official reference points, compared historical maps with modern measurements, and marked the boundary on the ground. When the work was complete, the result was even stronger than I expected. The hot spring was not sitting directly on a questionable or disputed line. It was entirely inside my property. So was the ticket booth. So was part of the path tourists used to reach it. The new survey stakes created a visible line through the area. One of them stood only a short distance from the sign reading, Crestline Ridge Community Hot Spring. We now had the deed. We had the title history. We had the boundary. But when Renata saw the survey markers, She did not close the operation. She sent another letter. This one warned me not to interfere with what she called established community access. My attorney responded with an 11-page demand letter. It explained the ownership history, cited the title findings, included the professional survey, and documented the HOA's commercial use of the property. The letter demanded that Crestline Ridge immediately stop bringing residents and tourists onto the land. It required the HOA to remove the ticket booth, delete every advertisement, disclose the revenue it had collected, and return the money. It also warned that any continued entry would be treated as deliberate trespass. Renata did not apologize. Instead, the HOA's attorney introduced a new argument. He claimed Crestline Ridge had acquired a prescriptive easement. In simple terms, the HOA argued that because residents had used the area openly and continuously for approximately 5 years, the association had gained a permanent right to continue using it, even without a written agreement. Their response described the land as neglected. It claimed the HOA had maintained access while I remained absent. It suggested my family had tolerated community use for so long that we had lost the right to object. For the first time, the dispute was no longer only about where the boundary stood. The HOA was now claiming that years of entering my property had created a legal right to keep entering it. They had no deed. They had no written permission. They had no recorded agreement. But they believed 5 years of unauthorized use could replace all 3. Their argument depended on one crucial idea. They needed me to have been absent. I wasn't. Managing thousands of acres requires more than memory, so I keep maintenance records. Fence repairs, erosion, spring flow, fallen trees, road conditions, and drainage problems are all documented. When I opened the notebook covering the 5-year period the HOA relied on, I found 47 separate entries involving the southern boundary. 47. Some recorded fence repairs near the spring. Others described replacing wire, clearing brush, inspecting erosion, checking water levels, or resetting posts after winter damage. Many of those entries were supported by photographs. The images contained digital timestamps. Several showed recognizable trees, sections of the fence, survey reference points, or the spring basin itself. I also had receipts for fencing materials and fuel purchased during several of those trips. The HOA had described me as an absent owner who had allowed the association to control the land without interruption. My records showed that I had repeatedly entered, inspected, maintained, and repaired the exact area they claimed to possess. Their tourists had not replaced my control. Their signs had not erased my ownership. And my decision not to start a confrontation every time someone crossed the boundary did not transfer my property rights to them. Renata had mistaken patience for absence. The notebook proved I had been there all along. My attorney reviewed every entry and organized the photographs by date. Then he looked at the worn cover and said, "This is the part they never expected you to have." The HOA had a polished website, printed waivers, a ticket booth, and a lawyer's letter. I had a mud-stained maintenance notebook. Only one of those things told the truth about who had actually managed the land. At the hearing, the HOA tried to present the hot spring as a long-established feature of community life. Their attorney talked about residents who had used it for years. He described the access as open, visible, and continuous. He said families had come to rely on the spring as one of the benefits of living in Crestline Ridge. Renata sat behind him with a thick binder resting on the table. She looked confident. Then my attorney began presenting our evidence. First came the original ownership documents. Then the complete title search showing no recorded HOA easement. Next came the professional survey establishing that the spring, the ticket booth, and the access path were inside my property. After that, He displayed the HOA's advertisements. The judge saw the $25 admission price. He saw the visitor instructions. He saw the words, Crestline Ridge Community Hot Spring. He saw photographs of volunteers collecting money beside the water. Then my attorney asked the HOA to produce the document that authorized any of it. A deed. A recorded easement. Written permission. A boundary agreement. A contract. Anything signed by me or by a previous owner. They produced nothing. The HOA attorney returned to the 5-year claim. He argued that their use had been obvious and that I had failed to prevent it. That was when my attorney placed the maintenance notebook into evidence. He began walking through the 47 entries. Fence inspection. Spring check. Erosion repair. Brush clearing. Post replacement. Boundary maintenance. One date after another. Then came the photographs. Each image connected a written entry to the physical property. In several photographs, sections of the old fence were clearly visible. In others, I was standing near the spring months or years before the HOA claimed it had taken control. My attorney asked Renata whether the HOA had maintained the boundary fence. She said no. Had the HOA repaired erosion around the spring basin? No. Had it paid the property taxes? No. Had it ever notified me that it claimed a legal right before it began selling tickets? No. Had it asked permission to advertise the spring? No. Had it told tourists they were entering private property? No. Had it obtained any written authorization from my family? Number. The more questions she answered, the smaller her binder seemed. The HOA had collected thousands of dollars from a spring it did not own, on land it had no recorded right to enter, under an easement it could not prove existed. And the notebook destroyed the claim that I had abandoned control. Renata wanted the court to believe the spring had become community property because she had called it a community amenity often enough. But a slogan on a sign was not a deed. A ticket booth was not an easement, and unauthorized profit was not ownership. When both sides finished, the judge closed the file in front of him. The room became completely silent. Then he began to speak. The court confirmed my exclusive ownership of the property and the hot spring. Crestline Ridge had no recorded easement authorizing access. The HOA was ordered to stop sending residents, tourists, volunteers, employees, or contractors onto the land. A permanent injunction prohibited further trespass. The ticket operation had to close. The advertisements had to be removed. The HOA was also ordered to return the $11,400 we could document, along with interest. It was required to cover my legal costs as well. Within days, the ticket booth disappeared. The online listings were deleted. The path that had once been crowded with visitors became quiet again. I repaired the damaged section of fence and installed a clear sign beside the boundary. Private property. Access by written permission only. Renata had spent months insisting that the spring belonged to the community. In the end, every claim she made was defeated by records she could have checked before selling the first ticket. But the ruling was not the end of her problems. The people living inside Crestline Ridge had just learned what their board had done with their money. Residents discovered that Renata had described the spring as an HOA asset, even though no ownership document supported that claim. They learned association funds had been used to defend the ticket operation. They learned the board had ignored an 11-page demand letter backed by a deed, a title search, and a professional survey. Now the HOA had to return the revenue, pay interest, and cover legal expenses. Several residents said they had believed their dues included lawful access to the spring. Others were furious that the board had exposed the entire community to liability rather than admit it had made a mistake. At the next internal meeting, Renata tried to describe the ruling as a technical setback. The residents did not accept that explanation. They voted her out. The woman who had tried to control 5,700 acres of someone else's land could no longer control her own position on the board. Her authority had always depended on people believing she knew what she was doing. The court record proved she did not. I never blamed the families who had paid to use the spring. Most of them had simply trusted the advertisements. My dispute was with the people who had turned private property into an HOA revenue source without first proving that they owned it or had permission to use it. After the case, I reinforced the fence, improved the boundary signs, and created a written process for any future requests to enter the property. The spring returned to what it had been before Crestline Ridge tried to claim it. Quiet. Protected. Part of the land my family had cared for since 1931. The most important evidence in the case was not dramatic. It was not a secret recording. It was not a surprise witness. It was a deed, a survey, dated photographs, and a maintenance notebook containing 47 ordinary entries. That is the lesson. When someone challenges your property rights, anger is not evidence. A deed is evidence. A survey is evidence. A photograph is evidence. A written record is evidence. Renata had a title, a board, a lawyer, and a clipboard. I had the land, the boundary, and 47 dated records. Only one of us had real authority.